The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We're very excited to have everyone join us for the webinar looking at how to securely provision production data. My name is Janine Michaels. I'm an account manager or accounts marketing manager at Redgate. And with me today, we're lucky to have Richard Macaskill presenting. Richard is our expert on data governance and also a product manager here at Redgate for our provision solutions. So Richard will be leading this webinar. So if you have any questions, please ask them in the questions box and we'll answer them as we go along. Alternatively, we'll answer them at the end of Richard's session. So I'm going to hand over to Richard now.
Okay, thanks, Janine. So first of all, just a very brief introduction to Redgate, so there may be a few of you who aren't familiar with us. We're in use by most of the Fortune 100. We're very, very widely used, the largest vendor of SQL Server tooling on the Microsoft data platform. We have a very extensive reach into the SQL Server, DBA and developer communities with 2 million registered users on our SQL Server Central and SimpleTalk websites, just to pull a couple of those facts out from the sheet in front of you. So as Janine said, I'm Richard Macaskill. I'm a product manager. I've been looking after some of Redgate's recent work in database provisioning, in managed provisioning, addressing some of the challenges around address the common provisioning problems that we see, and also the regulatory aspects, the requirement to minimize risk while moving data around your organization, especially as part of the software development lifecycle. So today we're going to look at some of the common problems that people experience using provisioning databases into their software development environments, some of the changing regulatory requirements, and how a new way of putting together some Redgate tools can make, we think, a significant impact on those problems. I'll be demonstrating some of the integrations between our products that make up the SQL Provision offer, and that allow you to do delivery of databases in a secure, managed format and a repeatable workflow that really fits into DevOps life cycles. So why do people go through the trouble of provisioning databases outside of production? Well, first of all, let's have a look at the issues. I mean, the pain is real, but let's have a look at what we need to address as we're trying to automate there. So first of all, there is the time involved. Restoring even a medium-sized database risks blocking a team. It risks dead time for your software team, for your DBA, for the management of it. And the management is painful because it involves finding disk space for database copies, often multiple copies, especially if you want to obtain any sort of isolation of development effort so that people aren't getting in each other's way. Then, of course, you've got the concerns over how you can securely move data into environments that are often less protected than the production environment would be. And the requirement to deliver databases to teams often leads to teams sharing databases, sharing access, and risking stepping on each other's toes. Even the best software teams can have difficulties with coordinating their efforts. So we're going to go to a poll. We'll do just a couple of polls in here. It would be really appreciated if you could humour us and sort of help the engagement by telling us a little bit about your blockers to provisioning. I mentioned a few there: limits of time and storage, limits of regulations, and then hardware, licenses of software that you need to use in multiple environments. So I'll just let a few of those votes come in, and then we'll take a look at how your fellow listeners on this call see their problems. Okay, I think we're about there. Just a few seconds for if there's any last vote to come in. Okay, I think we'll say that's a completed poll. So we've actually, quite interestingly, we've We ran this webinar in European-friendly time this morning, our time, and we found regulatory and sensitivity concerns were quite clearly on top. Among the attendees here, it's neck and neck between regulations and sensitivity and storage concerns. So maybe perhaps a bit of an insight there on the impact of some European-centric regulatory change. Okay, thanks very much for voting on that. So it's quite painful, it's quite tedious to manage the delivery of databases into a copy down environment, into that sort of shift left workflow. But most organizations do it. So our polls have found around 72% tell us that they use a copy of production data in their production databases in their development, test and QA environments. And that's pretty consistent across several polls. Even other organizations, I believe the Puppet Labs DevOps survey, which is quite a large base, found I think it was 80% in their recent refresh on that. Consistently, we find that organizations copy down live data despite all the difficulties for use in their non-production environments. So why do they do that? We can ask the software teams, and when we do, we find that they strongly agree that it's desirable to use production data in dev and test. After all, they're the ones who are going to be facing the consequences, or at least suffering the embarrassment of code going into production which doesn't behave as expected. And they find it difficult to generate data sufficiently accurately to test, sufficiently close to production. Remember, very often production databases outlive the applications that write to them. There are often multiple iterations, and I often think if you look at a production database of any age, then it's something like going on an architectural dig. You will find evidence of versions of your systems that perhaps you weren't even aware of, that perhaps predate your development team. So we'll do one more poll, if that's okay. I'd like to know really where, from listeners, where does data in your development environment come from? So I'll just take a quick pause again. If you could vote there, that would be very welcome. Okay, that's great. We'll just let a few more of those votes come in. Okay, fantastic. Okay, thanks very much for that. We're seeing some pretty consistent results with previous surveys and with the European attendees this morning. So most people, it is a copy of production. For others, a close second is a modified copy of production where some kind of operation has been performed, and for a few is manually created. This speaks to the difficulty, I think, of really getting generated data to fulfill the testing requirements, to build the confidence that we really want. So despite all the difficulties, despite all the pains, the preferred option is still to take that production data and move it into a non-production environment. So even within teams, between developers and DBAs, we have some risk of conflicting priorities. So the development team wants that data as quickly as possible. They want isolation, they want to be able to make changes, experiment, they want to be able to reset quickly. They want to be able to perform the sort of operations that they can perform when writing application code. If they go down a path that isn't promising, that isn't fruitful in making the change, they can just reset and go back to the beginning, and very often there's no great loss, especially if they're using modern source control techniques and branching and the like. The DBA has a different set of priorities, of course, and wants to know that copies of data are in places that they're expected to be. It's not in the DBA's interest to have databases at all four corners of the organization or to be unclear about where they might be, because that DBA or head of data services, IT manager, whoever it might be, the person with the key responsibilities for the databases, needs to be able to assure the business And it is they who are going to have to answer difficult questions if databases are in unexpected places or not subject to the expected protections. Why does the DBA care about the pressure that they might suffer? Well, of course, we know that some industries are heavily regulated, and that's been something that's developed over time. HIPAA and SOX, PCI are probably the best well known. The GDPR, of course, I'm sure you'll have heard of the regulatory change that is sweeping Europe. And coming in very soon, May the 25th of this year. But there are movements elsewhere as well. There's the National Institute of Standards and Technology is promoting the use of its standards outside the federal bodies that it was originally intended to draft standards for. That might be very interesting to watch. We think that that might be the way that some tighter regulatory oversight emerges in the United States in coming years. And of course, those industry-specific regulations are still there. They're not going away, and they get tightened up and reviewed periodically. There are also state-level in the US regulations which are under fairly regular review. So there's the existing regulatory landscape. Now, I'm not going to go on about GDPR long into the night. This is especially to a largely US audience. But I would like to point out to that this isn't a standalone, even though the EU is, of course, 300 million citizens and a very significant trading bloc. It's also not the only place to be implementing this kind of risk assessment framework in response to the privacy concerns. So Japan has pretty much duplicated the general data protection regulation of the EU, so as to minimize friction when trading and when exchanging data with European bodies. Australia has taken many of the similar concerns, although that's labelled a 2016 bill. I believe that was passed in November 2017. And the UK is committed to basically an approach to data privacy, which is to run Control C, Control V on the GDPR text. So I think there's a very real sense that we might well be looking at an international, global wave of regulation that our industry at large is going to have to respond to. So we also have to consider the stakeholders in knowing what we're doing with data. Internally, of course, we're seeing more interest from the board. GDPR is a board level concern. It very explicitly states that the organisation is responsible, not the individuals performing the operations. There has to be board level awareness. If you have a risk or compliance function, they will be growing more aware of the concerns that exist around the management of data, as well as the usual InfoSec departments are on the rise, and IT management is going to care. The regulators, authorities. In the case of this new wave of regulation, we're also seeing that they're designed such that a rising tide will raise all boats. The intention is that organizations will hold each other to account. It's not just about the regulator overseeing the activity of individual companies, suppliers. The supply chain of an organization is expected to be under scrutiny to ensure that there is good practice throughout business. Shareholders will be increasingly aware of the impact of good practice not being observed. So it's not just regulatory, of course. There's a data breach epidemic that none of us could fail to have noticed. We've got Equifax and Uber, of course, so the big headlines. The Yahoo scandal of a few years ago that turned out to be impacting a great many more. So on this chart from the Identity Theft Resource Centre doesn't include 2017. I'm pretty confident that record of data breaches will be up and dramatically up and to the right in the revised version of that when it's issued. What's also interesting and relevant, especially when you're controlling the movement of data inside your organization, is that the majority of breaches are caused by insiders. So this was this source. You can see the source there at the bottom was Clear Swift. If you have a look around various surveys, there's a broad range of findings, but most investigations conclude that the majority are caused by insiders. So it's a very real concern. So protecting your organization's data cannot just be about protecting the perimeter of your local area network or implementing good policies on your firewall. Important as they are, you've also got to show concern about how you are moving data. And if you're moving data in order to improve your development and test processes, then you have to give thought to how you're controlling that and whether that is adequate and acceptable to your organization. So whether you're expecting to be GDPR compliant, whether you are dealing with EU citizens as customers or as employees, that is also relevant. Whether you're moving data into or out of the European Union, the principles that these new wave of regulations are seeking to apply are good general sound principles. They're often the same as you'll find in COBIT 5, in ISO 27001. There's a lot of commonality there. But what's important is that these new regulations are bringing a statutory responsibility into the equation. It's not just a case of doing the right thing, it's a case of showing that you're doing the right thing as a statutory responsibility, not just when something has gone wrong, not just bolting the stable door after the horse has bolted. The expectation is that you act now in order to improve your processes so that you can show that you're trying to do the right thing. It's also very clear in all these regulations that nobody is expected to be perfect, but they're expected to align their interests with the interests of the people whose data they're holding. So I'll move on to what Redgate has to offer in this space. SQL Provision allows you to copy production data, amend it on the way through, and then deliver it to dev, QA, test, functions outside production in a way that is managed, controlled, and predictable, and leaves behind an audit trail. So the SQL Provision offering initially is made up of two products. Our SQL Clone product has been on the market for about a year, just coming up to a year, and has made quite a splash in data virtualization for especially organizations implementing DevOps and wanting to bring the database into those repeatable, rapid, small iterations with feedback loops that are so valuable in delivering value. But added to that, we've got Massacre, which is a product which was acquired a couple of months ago. And we're bringing these two together, making sure that they work together and interoperate in a way that allows us to really create a safe barrier for production data. And I'll speak more to that in just a moment. But we're committed to, when you buy SQL Provision just now, you're getting two products that work very, very well together. We're working right now to integrate them so that the whole experience is more holistic and an end-to-end process, ever easier to do the right thing. But what is the right thing? Well, many of you, when we ran the poll, there was the joint top concern about making copies available for development and test was the storage space. So virtualization of databases addresses that very efficiently. SQL Clone we uses the virtualization technology built into 64-bit Windows in order to deliver full databases, read-write, that act exactly like other databases, except that the bulk of the data is not on the local instance. So developers can work on their workstations with very, very small footprints of data. The only data that's actually delivered to their workstation is a differencing disk, typically 40 to 100 megabytes in size, regardless of the size of the original database. So, and if we're working, especially in DevOps cycles where we're iterating quickly and disposing of databases as we work through our work items, and in the parlance of DevOps, treating them as cattle, not pets, then we're able to realize dramatic storage space savings, as well as the convenience of rapidly being able to stand up databases for particular purposes. I mentioned those numbers about the proportion using production data. Also in our surveys, we're finding that 30 to 40% are running scripts in order to sanitize, in order to protect the most sensitive data. And our solution allows you to bring a great deal of sophistication to that and go beyond the most basic script running. But if script running is adequate for you, that is also supported. Our software, the SQL clone, is API first, it's PowerShell first, and I'll show you in the demo shortly how we can automate the provisioning requests and also the masking requests. And moreover, we're finding that organizations, DBAs, data service teams are greatly appreciating the ability to see what has been delivered into the non-production environments and to manage it over time. With role-based provisioning permissions, we're able to prepare images in an authorized area using highly privileged accounts. So, for example, the DBA or IT manager can set up the initial process, but then it can be hands-off. That part can be automated, and developers, analysts, anyone in your organization that needs to work with those sanitized copies can self-serve, and they have the permissions sufficient to allow them to self-serve, but not sufficient to allow them to change what it is that they can serve themselves with. In fact, we think that SQL Provision makes up a boundary. We can position it as a boundary between your production systems and your non-production systems. If you are subject to GDPR compliance, then that would be the boundary between the consented processing, the thing that the data subject, your customer or your supplier, has agreed to, and the non-consented processing. So it's pretty clear from recent clarification of the regulations that we cannot assume that we can make use of people's data beyond the very explicitly stated in order to send me a bill, in order to show me my make recommendations for purchase. Those are the only uses that are allowed, and we cannot assume or imply that there's that covers a need in order to make our software better, in order to test and make sure we don't make mistakes. So just as you wouldn't connect your corporate LAN to the internet without a firewall, although in fact in the late 90s you would find organizations doing that, that very quickly changed and it became the norm to have proper perimeter protection for your local area network. I think we can see a situation arising where we need internal boundaries for our production data between the uses that we're allowed and adequately protecting for, and the other uses that we might want to bring in. So I'm just going to switch into a short demonstration of, I'm going to show a couple of techniques for dealing with sensitive data and using SQL clone in two different ways in order to provide that extra security. So here you have you can see the SQL clone web interface, and I have some images here. Just briefly, SQL clone works by creating images which are a point-in-time copy of the files of the database. It's an absolute point in time. Copies of the database files are taken over, isolated completely from production, and put into a Windows file share, where they are then delivered as clone databases. So the operation of creating the image, the initial operation, is something like it's going to take about as long as a backup or restore operation for that database, because it is moving that amount of data. It's kind of a pay once or a free refills policy, I guess, in the jargon. So each time you create a clone database, I can see here I have Stack Overflow, Brent Ozar's cut from March 2017, and I've created 9 clone databases against it. The 114 gigabytes took 25 minutes or so to copy into the repository, and then from that point each clone database takes a few seconds to deliver and a few seconds to refresh. So let's just see this. We've got this banner here. We do these. I can clear this, but we've recently introduced the ability to run scripts during that first initial image creation process before the images are available for cloning. So I'll just clear that. And I'll go through the workflow of creating a sanitized image and making that available to my development team. So I'm going to use a backup as the source. I can use various different formats of backup, differential backups, password protected, striped backups. I'm going to choose one of the machines that SQL Clone can see in order to perform that operation. And I'm going to just use a backup file of AdventureWorks, of course, for a simple example. I am now prompted to make some modifications if I wish, and I do want to make some modifications. I'm going to select a script that I've prepared, and let me just show you what this script is and why I've prepared it. So this is the use case that the 30 to 40% tell us about. So if I look at AdventureWorks, I did a little bit of looking around AdventureWorks, and of course, no surprise, it is full of personal data that I don't necessarily want to expose to a larger audience. So if I look at the person.email address, as expected, that has email addresses in it. The pay history table has some salary details. I actually have some full documents, which are the CVs resumes that applicants have submitted, and down here I've got some phone numbers. So I'm not particularly happy about having any of that data outside the production environment. So in this example, I've done the most obvious, the most basic kind of obfuscation. I'm changing my email address to something that shouldn't do any harm. I'm replacing sensitive data. I'm removing the resumes, and I'm updating the phone numbers to 0. So going back to SQL Clone, I can continue my flow. I'm going to tell SQL Clone where I want to put this image, and I'm going to give it a name. As you can see, I've run this demo before, so I'm going to call this AW 2012 Masked. AdventureWorks, as we know, is only a couple of 100 megabytes. This shouldn't take too long. And before, as I said, the image is prepared and released, we're going to do this operation, run the masking script. I'm complete now. I now have a database available, and I'm going to create a clone from that just to see that the operation completed as I expected. So again, I'm going to create a clone on my local instance. My clone database I will call demo 31 Jan, just in case I've left an example there. So this is going to perform the operation of mounting the SQL clone database. Now that's completed. That takes a few seconds and takes up, in this case, 40 megabytes of disk space. Just remember, this will be very similar regardless of the size of the database, because we're not actually moving data. We're creating a differencing disk and then pointing ourselves at the shared data in the image. If I refresh my view of databases here, I can see my, if I can recall my database, it's called Mass Demo 31 Jan, and I'm going to run my script that expose the sensitive data on that new database. SQL prompt, when it's refreshed, knows about the new database, of course. And if I run this, I can see, as expected, I've got tested example.com. I've got a flat pay rate of 123, and I'm quite happy that that's a reasonable level of protection for my data. And I can continue and release this to my developers. Incidentally, I did mention the permissions. I can set different levels of permissions in here in the SQL Clone interface. And I'm working with a handful of different machines. So in my case, I've got, in my test environment, I've got 7 workstations registered with my SQL Clone server. So that's a very straightforward, very simple operation to perform some masking. But I want to do something a little bit more sophisticated, or at least show how something a bit more sophisticated can be done. Masking is far from simple for most organizations, for most databases. There are many reasons for this. There is consistency required between values in different databases, in different tables, for example. or even different databases. But in between tables, the same values that are updated may need to be updated consistently. Sometimes that's because explicitly they are foreign keys. Therefore, if we update the value of the primary key, we'll break or will be prevented from updating values which are referenced elsewhere. That's quite common in the UK. Certainly, the NHS databases frequently use the NHS ID, the patient's ID, as a primary key referenced by foreign keys on other tables. Then there are other requirements of consistency. Are there any validation checks in your application that you want to exercise against your database, for example? Does the zip code have to correspond to a state that that zip code is intended for? So if you find that if you have any of those kind of validation rules in your systems, then just scripting may well not meet your need, and it may, as well as being difficult to maintain. So I mentioned the acquisition that Redgate made recently. I shall just bring up the interface and briefly show you some of the operations that you can perform with Data Massacre for SQL Server. So Data Massacre is this is a product that's been in development for 15 years. It's a mature, battle-hardened approach to performing masking. And as such, it confronts lots of the problems that people experience. This tool can mask pretty much any database that you care to throw at it, and it can deal with those consistency requirements across tables. It can deal with the requirement to be internally consistent. In this case, I've got you can see that there is a set of rules that are going to execute, and I'll show you a couple of those. This is still a relatively straightforward case. In this case, I can see that I'm dealing with the values on the columns on the contacts table, and I have a collection of data sets that I can choose from. There's a very broad range. There's some hundreds of data sets are supplied with Data Massacre, and custom sets can also be defined. In this case, we've got an internally consistent data set. That is that the names are set up such that male and female names are supplied in the correct proportion. We have, if we look at some of the other features that are available, we're able to force the distribution of null rows, for example. And this has got a script there which is going to be run with some substitution variables, and is going to put in some generated sample data. This second operation is using an expression to generate a data value. In this case, it's generating an email address, and it's using some of the values in the table. Following on from the replacement of the original values with generated ones, it's going to use those generated ones in order to put together a realistic email address. So still pretty straightforward, but perhaps just a little sight of some of the options available. I'm going to run this with PowerShell. I mentioned that SQL Clone is API first, PowerShell first, and the integrations are coming ever closer between the different components in our provisioning system that you will get with SQL Provision. So this I won't pour over in detail the PowerShell script, but it's running some basic PowerShell operations to connect to the same SQL Clone instance that we were looking at there. It's going to create a temporary image from a backup file. It's then going to invoke the Data Massacre program to perform a masking operation using that masking set that I defined, and it's then going to create a clone database for my developers, and for each of the developers in that collection of developers I defined, I'm going to get a new isolated copy of the database. So let's just see this in motion. I'm just going to kick this off, and we can watch the operation take place in SQL Clone. So the temp image is being created, just so that we're going to create a clone just quickly onto that temp image, so that we can then perform that operation. This isn't going to be exposed to anybody. The masking operation will be complete before the developers are free to use this clone. So so we can see that the This image is being created now. Watching progress bars, of course, is the best part of any demo, as we know, and we can see that these operations we're now going through the second phase, where we're creating clone databases and then making them available. But these clone databases are being created against the masked original, such that the sensitive data has been removed. Okay, that's completed. I'm just going to go back to SQL Server Management Studio. I delivered all those clone databases into the same SQL instance. In a more realistic scenario, of course, I'd want to deliver them across my team of developers. So let's have a look at the original. So this is the original database that we took the backup from, that forums Redgate production, and the data that I wanted to get rid of. You might recognise some of the names here. So Mr. Fritchie and Mr. Jones would be, I'm sure, quite unhappy at having their phone number displayed to our developers. I want to make sure that these values are not used. So the copies of the database that are delivered using SQL clone are the ones that run against that masking operation. So let's just see how it looks following the masking. And of course, as expected, I no longer have Fritchie and Jones there. I have some generated values, and the email address there is generated as well. So we're building an ever closer integration between SQL clone and Data Massacre. This is what it's going to look like in about a couple of weeks' time, I think. We'll have the option of applying T-SQL scripts or masking sets that have been defined and we can do those together. We can have collections of scripts and masking sets, and they're going to be applied before the image is released and before it's made available to the developers or whoever it is using it downstream. I'm just going to pause and have a look at see if we've got some questions there. I think there's one there. Okay, there's a question there. Will you be adding per user permissions for cloning from a specific image in the future? It is on the roadmap. I can't tell you exactly when that would happen. The coming soon aspect. So that first question is about having a slightly more granular set of permissions. At the moment, they are kind of role based. We very much have on the roadmap the ability to be specific to groups of images or groups of destinations, groups of instances that you can deliver clones to. So it's very likely to be the area of work that the team are looking at, the development team are looking at after this phase of work, delivering this ability to implement masking sets. Just another one on there, the question about how soon is coming soon. So the ability to implement the masking sets, we think, will be out within a couple of weeks. So I hope I've answered the right the right how soon is coming soon. But yeah, that's coming very shortly indeed. We're continuing with there's a great demand in among our SQL clone customer base for implementing masking. In fact, there has been from day one, and that's only growing. So we're going to make sure that we service that need that we see. Okay, I'm just going to move on this is the next version actually that the developers are working on that you see in front of you there. So SQL Provision is a solution for managing your delivery in a way that reduces the blocking, reduces the effort required by the team doing very often picking up tickets. Very often, as I mentioned, it's delegated up. It's the people in the organization who have the keys to production who have to fulfill these requests. And they're in the uncomfortable position of seeming to be blocking teams while they fulfill provisioning requests. They want to get away from juggling disk space, and sanitizing data in a way that's consistent is something that's increasingly should be a solved problem, or we think we can bring some automation to bear in a way that really allows people to use the shift left practices effectively and safely. So SQL Provision is available now. It's on a subscription license. Go over to redgate.com. It's based on for details, or speak to our sales team. It's based on the volume of data that is required to go through our provisioning system. By that we mean it's the volume of data at rest in the source system, in the production system normally. So tot up the size of the databases there, and that will tell you that you want to use with SQL Provision, and that will tell you the tier that you need to be licensing for. And of course, it's an accelerator for DevOps. It's a great enabler for isolated development, and it's also part of something that you'll see a lot more of in very close at hand. We're concentrating on addressing the concerns arising out of the data breach epidemic, as well as the regulatory need, and Redgate looking to really step into this space of helping DBAs, data professionals, to provide the assurances that their organization requires. Okay, I'm just going to see if there's have a look for any more questions. If you do have any more questions that you haven't asked yet, please do put them in now. I've got another one that's come through. Will there be an option to copy images so we don't have to rerun the image creation for the same database on a given day? That is a good question. We have had that on the of course there are various the need to copy images is often to I think the questioner's intent is probably that we don't have to go through the whole movement of data for the image creation, so that we could effectively top up an image or use it as a baseline. That is something that's available to us. It's been on the backlog, and we very much want to get to that. But as with the previous question about granular permissions, because we're an agile team, we sort of we work in small iterations and then validate the effects of our work. As a customer, I know that it can be a little bit frustrating to get the we'll listen to customers' answer over and over again. This is something we very much want to do, and we see this as part of the sort of maturing provisioning platform. Along with some other requests that we get regularly, such as working with Azure SQL database. We're looking at that very actively. Working with containers, we're looking at very actively. And we also have requests for full-size databases, not always to use the clone technology in order to deliver the small database. At times, if you're going to UAT, if you're going to staging, perhaps you want to be more production similar than you would be with a SQL clone database. I've got another one there from Todd is asking, is this product a device? Can it be installed in various data centers? No, it is an application. It's a server application that runs with agents on SQL Server instances that it's delivering clone databases into. It doesn't need to touch production, but because we can use backup files of various kinds. But no, it's not. There's not a device, and there isn't a device version of that for installation. SQL tool belts, another frequently asked questions. Another frequently asked question. No, we're not planning to put this into the SQL tool belt. We see a slightly different path, whereby this is part of largely server tools, which a collection of server tools which reinforce your ability to manage your SQL estate. Whereas the tool belt, I know it's not an entirely clear division, but it's predominantly user focused. It's tools that work at the desktop for productivity reasons, as well as the DevOps enablement. We don't have any plans to put this in the tool belt at the moment. Very good next question. Are you planning to make this part of DLM tools for CI integration? Many of our SQL Clone customers are using SQL Clone and SQL Provision now as part of their CI workflows. Because it's PowerShell first, it fits very nicely, and some of our most sophisticated users have been baked right into just setting up whole environments for CI, and also as well as for development work to take place isolated. So part of the DLM toolset is complementary, I would say, rather than is in terms of selling the product. We're not planning to make it part of DLM. Another very good question. And does SQL Clone let me set up retention policies to let me manage DB images, or do I have to delete old images manually? Quite a few of our customers, in fact, even the early days, a couple of our earliest SQL Clone adopters, I went to visit them in London and found that they'd kind of solved this problem themselves using PowerShell scripts, which is often an indicator that there's a real need, and that's something that we should do. They call it. There's a worked example actually on the documentation site that was basically lifted from one of those customers. They called them Cinderella clones, whereby they told all the developers they can create as many clones as they like, but they will disappear after 7 days. Not at midnight, but after 7 days. So we do recognise that retention policies could be a very good approach to maintaining ongoing control over your SQL clone copies, but we haven't put that in yet, but it is a very good idea, and we do recognise that, so that you may well see that at some point soon. Okay, there's another good one there. So do the set of rules for security compliance apply to an environment level or database level? For instance, if the manipulation of a set of databases happens within the same environment, the masking will likely not be needed. On the other hand, if the manipulation targets a third-party environment, those rules should be applied in full. Very, very interesting point. I think I understand the intent there. At the moment, the application is at a database level. Of course, you can coordinate, different operations of masking, of script running, in order to fulfill different sets of requirements. So you're not restricted to, to one set of masking sets or one set of scripts for providing a particular workflow. You are able to customize it towards your need, I would think. But the straight answer to the question is it's not at the environment. Let me just, sorry for the clicking, I'm just rereading the beginning. It's not at the environment level at the moment. It's at the delivery of, it's at the creation of the image level at the moment. Now, this was just our way of sort of stepping through the needs that we've observed and that we've spoken to customers about. Very many of them would like the changes that are applied to be environment specific. So if this is going into UAT, these things will happen. If this is going into development, these things will happen. And we do have that on our roadmap as well. So that's kind of a second phase of, as with the permissions, our first phase was role-based access to SQL clone operations, and we'll step into more granular. Similarly, with the masking and manipulation, our first pass is to, as part of the image creation, and the second phase of that would be to specify the kind of operations that will be carried out dependent on the delivery, depending on the target. So we've been working on that and understanding the specifics of users' need there. So yes, we do want to do that. Okay, some great questions there. Thanks very much for the engagement, everyone. Do appreciate it. Now we've got 14-day trials of all Redgate software are obtainable on the Redgate website. So our big themes are Database DevOps, of course, as you know, we've been leading for some years. The secondary theme that we're really committed to solving problems throughout the industry of SQL Server data professionals is data privacy and protection. If you want to know more, please just drop us a line at sales@redgate.com. If you want an extended trial or you need more information, we are happy to help. And you'll find, if you're not familiar with the Redgate salespeople, they're not the hard. They're more helpful than they are there for the hard sell. There is also, if you're interested in the DevOps side, there's a DevOps webinar tomorrow that you should be able to register for. And there'll be a follow-up email containing links to these slides and some of the information that I've passed over today. So thank you very much for your time. We do appreciate you joining us, and have a fantastic day. Thank you.